Protests in China against the government's strict COVID measures.
Thousands of demonstrators across the country.
China is currently in the midst of what observers are calling the most serious event in the country's history since Tiananmen Square. After 2 years of withstanding the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chinese had had enough. Protesters against the country's COVID policy have taken to the streets, with demonstrations happening in 15 cities and counting all over China. Across the country, the people are echoing the same sentiment: no to further lockdowns. The Chinese Communist Party and President Xi Jinping, and yes to freedom, democracy, and human rights. What has led to this rare series of events in China that is still picking up steam as we speak? China's zero COVID policy. In the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak from its own region, Wuhan, China adopted a zero COVID policy to fight against the pandemic. Its goal was to completely eradicate the disease and leave no traces of it in Chinese territory. To do this, the country employed a variety of measures, such as a mass testing, closing off the country's borders to tourists and quarantining homes, communities, and even entire cities. Countries across the globe use these same measures to contain the virus and prevent as many deaths as possible. But the world immediately realized that erasing COVID completely was nearly impossible. The next best solution, then, was to strengthen ourselves from the fatal effects of the virus. Thus came the vaccinations, which helped contain the spread of the virus and equipped us to fight the pandemic. While it took some time to see the effects, eventually, countries began opening up again. Restrictions were eased, economies were recovering, and the world entered the new normal. All except China. It's been 2 years since the initial spread of the pandemic, and the country is still persistent in its zero COVID policy. When cases spiked back in March, China felt the need to double down on its efforts. Extreme Chinese measures against COVID. To that end, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, used extreme measures to stop the spread of COVID and completely wipe it away from the country.
Millions under strict and prolonged lockdowns, even for just a few cases.
A single COVID case would mean an entire city would be shut off from the rest of China and must undergo mass testing. Lockdowns were imposed, and unlike those around the world a couple of years ago, these were done by force. Apartment buildings were fenced, its doors welded from the outside, and even bicycles were padlocked to ensure that nobody gets out. Drones are being used to remind citizens of safety protocols or risk being arrested. They are also used to spray disinfectant across cities. They even went as far as cutting away from shots of live unmasked crowds while broadcasting the World Cup in Qatar. This is to hide the fact that many people get to go on about their lives, while the Chinese are required to lock themselves at home. Images of maskless fans at Qatar triggered the brewing frustration of the Chinese regarding their COVID protocols compared with the rest of the world. Anybody who exhibits COVID symptoms were forcefully taken away to government quarantine facilities that had the living conditions of a prison. One of these is located high in the mountains, where it was freezing cold and heating was unavailable. The government spared no one here, not even toddlers suspected of being infected. Children who were infected, or at the very least thought to be infected, were forcefully separated from their parents for days. Consequences of zero COVID. The CCP believes that such measures are necessary to ensure zero COVID in China, and if we're talking about lower cases, it has certainly done that. China has had only 5,200 COVID-related deaths since the start of the pandemic. This is a significantly lower number compared to other countries. For comparison, the United States has tallied 1.1 million deaths since 2020. But unlike the rest of the world, China is refusing more effective vaccines to fight the virus, preferring to use their own instead. Zero COVID came at a massive expense. Locked-in citizens who were not even sick starved, and if they didn't contract COVID, they became more vulnerable to other illnesses. Businesses stopped and hampered the economy. Factories and ports have closed for long periods because of the lockdowns. Unemployment rates are climbing. The real estate market is suffering, and international business relations are taking massive hits. Foreign companies rely on China to produce their goods. Because its factory operations are forced to stop often, the big companies also suffer. The World Health Organization has already tried and failed to convince China to change their anti-COVID strategy. President Xi Jinping remains convinced that zero COVID is the more effective route. But his constituents are starting to doubt him. China unleashed a vendetta on COVID so hard that it seemingly forgot the ultimate endgame of an anti-COVID measure, which was to make life easier for its people. But when cases kept spiking, the public grew frustrated with the CCP's ineffective and increasingly inconvenient tactics. The beginning of the protests. A number of events led to increasing unrest among the Chinese populace. In October, a 14-year-old girl died from COVID in a government quarantine facility. The public criticized the government for the inadequate care and living conditions of this facility, which may have contributed to the girl's death. Around the same time, workers in the world's largest iPhone factory owned by Foxconn escaped after being locked in the plant to contain the virus. Then, on November 3, 2022, news of a 3-year-old toddler's death in Lanzhou began circulating around the internet. The young boy was exposed to a gas leak in an apartment, but because of COVID restrictions that locked everyone inside the apartment, the boy's father could not get medical help soon enough. This sparked further outrage among the Chinese, while the CCP tried to block the spread of the news on social media. But the last straw was a fire in an apartment block in Urumqi on the event of November 24.
Adding to that anger is a fire that broke out in the capital of China's far west Xinjiang region on Thursday night.
A short circuit caused the fire and quickly spread across the apartment block. Because the CCP enforced lockdowns by locking doors from the outside, the victims were left with no way out as the fire swallowed them whole. Barricades around the apartment also prevented firefighters from entering the building, so they desperately tried putting out the fire from the outside. In the end, 10 people died, 3 of whom were children, and another 9 were injured. City officials denied that COVID restrictions prevented any chance of escape and rescue. They even branded the victims as weak for not being able to escape. This only served as an insult to injury for the Chinese people, and finally burst their bubble. In the wake of the November 24th fire, cities all over China swelled with protesters on the streets. 2 years of lockdown and simmering anger had finally exploded.
Monitoring extraordinary images coming in from China tonight, growing protests against extreme COVID lockdowns. And
thousands of demonstrators are angry with COVID lockdowns, many of them calling for democracy and political freedoms.
Protests in cities and universities. Rallies across Xinjiang, the region that includes the city of Urumqi, erupted on November 25th, the night after the fire. Protesters took to the streets and confronted the authorities while shouting in unison for an end to the lockdown. This prompted the authorities to loosen restrictions in Xinjiang, which had been set since August and have limited movement within the region. It should be noted that mass protests in areas like Xinjiang don't happen often, so it would take something critical to anger the locals here. Videos of the rallies spread through social media, but were quickly taken down by Chinese authorities. But Xinjiang isn't the only region in China that's protesting. The dissent has spread to other cities, such as Shanghai, Chengdu, Wuhan, and Beijing. Protests have been reported in 15 cities, where millions filled the streets to rage against the machine. Although these cities are miles apart, they share a common sentiment and similar goal. They all called for an end to the extreme COVID restrictions that have held the nation back. In some areas, such as Beijing, the message was more politically aggressive, with chants that accused the CCP of dictatorship. Some protesters even called for President Xi Jinping's resignation. Again, take note that mass uprisings in China are rare, but those that openly condemn the CCP happen once in a blue moon. The only event in history where something similar happened was in 1989 during the Tiananmen Square protests. Those ended with the infamous massacre, where authorities opened fire on the protesters. University students all over China have also joined the fray. Over 100 universities across the country have stood up against the CCP, including Tsinghua University in Beijing and Kyoto University in Xi'an. Students in these universities chanted for democracy, the rule of law, and freedom of speech. In Tsinghua University, students also opposed China's censorship by holding up blank pieces of paper as part of their protest. The authorities' response. While the authorities were able to control the rallies before the Urumqi fire, the mass protests that followed it were another story. The dissent was so strong among protesters during that weekend that they forced the authorities' hand. In Shanghai, local law enforcement arrested numerous protesters in Urumqi Street who called for President Xi to step down. This prompted people in other regions to reach out for their release. In Chengdu, the authorities pushed back against protesters and made several arrests. Even journalists from international media were not safe.
The BBC, the outlet he works for, says that Lawrence was kicked and handcuffed for hours before being released.
The BBC reported that one of its journalists who covered the protests in Shanghai was assaulted and detained by the police. Acts like this align with the CCP's struggle to prevent news about the situation from spreading throughout the international community. After a weekend of nationwide protests, police moved to secure cities like Shanghai and Beijing to prevent more rallies. Meanwhile, universities all over China sent their students home, hoping to curb future student protests. Despite the crackdown on these uprisings, the Chinese have sent a unified message that's loud and clear. This is a rare moment in the country, which will go down as one of the most significant events in China's history, all because the government is unwilling to move on from its zero-COVID policy. Do you feel these protests will lead to the end of China's zero-COVID policy? Share with us your thoughts in the comments section. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.